So now let's take a look at exercise 16. And in this exercise, you need to test the validity of the syllogisms that are given in each of the items. As the instructions say, for each of the following items, determine if the argument is valid or not, and if invalid, identify as many fallacies as you can find. And if you're identifying the fallacy of unequal distribution, specify which end term commits the fallacy. So number one, all burglars are unsocial, all burglars are enterprising, all enterprising persons are unsocial. So again, the first thing we do when we test a syllogism is first of all mark or identify the type of statements that we have that make up the two premises and the conclusion. And in this case, we note that we have all universal affirmative statements. We then want to go through the syllogism and determine which of the terms, if any, are distributed terms. So we could begin with the first premise, all burglars are unsocial. We know that burglars here is a distributed term because it is the subject of a universal. Unsocial, however, is not distributed. It's predicate of an affirmative. And again, in the second premise, the same thing. Burglars is distributed because it's subject of a universal. Enterprising is undistributed because it's predicate of an affirmative. And then finally, in the conclusion, enterprising persons is distributed here because it's subject of a universal, but unsocial is not distributed, predicate of an affirmative. So now that we have that information, we can apply the rules of inference. We look first for unequal negation, but we have three affirmative statements, so there won't be any unequal negation. We then look for the middle term, and we find the middle term because it is the term that appears in both premises, but not in the conclusion. So burglars is the middle term here, and we've already noted that burglars is distributed twice, and that tells us that this syllogism commits the fallacy of maldistributed middle. It commits that fallacy because the middle term is distributed twice, and the rule for middle terms is that the middle terms must be distributed once and only once. Then we can look at the end terms. We see the first end term, enterprising persons. It is distributed in the conclusion here as the subject of a universal, but it is not distributed in the second premise because it's predicate of an affirmative. And so we also then see the fallacy of unequal distribution of the end term, enterprising persons. And then finally, the other end term, which is unsocial people or unsocial. In this case, in the conclusion, that term is predicate of an affirmative. It's not distributed. And it's also predicate of an affirmative in the first premise, so it's not distributed there. And that's equal, so that particular end term is fine. But overall, the syllogism is invalid because it commits the fallacy of maldistributed middle and the fallacy of unequal distribution of the end term, enterprising persons. Number two, no credit card holders are deprived persons. No credit card holders are slum dwellers, and therefore all slum dwellers are deprived persons. So we have a universal negative and a universal negative, and then a universal affirmative in the conclusion. And we note, as we do before we apply the rules, which of the terms are distributed. In the first premise, both terms are distributed because we have a universal negative. So we have subject of a universal and predicate of a negative. And again, in the second premise, both terms are distributed. And then in the conclusion, the subject term, slum dwellers, is distributed because it's subject of a universal, but deprived persons is not distributed because it's predicate of an affirmative. And so now that we are ready, we can apply the rules of inference. The first rule about equal negation: the number of negative premises must equal the number of negative conclusions. And in this case, we have an affirmative conclusion: all slum dwellers are deprived persons, but we have two negative premises. And so this obviously, we can't have two negative conclusions. So obviously this syllogism commits the fallacy of unequal negation. And then we can look at the middle term. And here the middle term is credit card holders. It's the term that appears in both premises, but not in the conclusion. And in this case, we've already indicated that that term is distributed twice. So again, we have mal-distributed middle, because the rule for middle terms is middle terms must be distributed once and only once. Then we can look at the end terms, and the end term slum dwellers is distributed in the conclusion and distributed in the second premise. In the conclusion, it appears as the subject term of a universal, and in the second premise, it appears as the predicate of a negative. And so in both cases, that's distributed, and so that one's okay. But then we look at deprived persons, and deprived persons is not distributed in the conclusion, but it is distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of a negative. And so that's unequal. So we also have unequal distribution of the end term deprived persons. So three fallacies in number 2. Number 3. No saints are selfish. Francis is not selfish. Therefore, Francis is a saint. So in this case, one of the first things we have to do is note that we have an individual as the subject term in both the second premise and in the conclusion. And when we have an individual, we know that the statement is going to be a universal statement. So we would translate that second premise as no Francis are selfish, and we would translate the conclusion as a universal affirmative: all Francis are saints. And then we can proceed with the remainder of our analysis. So we have a universal negative in the first premise, a universal negative in the second premise, and a universal affirmative in the conclusion. We can then note that we have two distributed terms in the first premise and two distributed terms in the second premise, because both are universal negatives, and subjects of universals and predicates of negatives are distributed. And then in the conclusion, as a universal affirmative, we have a distributed subject term, Francis, but the predicate term, saints, is not distributed. So then as we apply the rules of inference, we note first that we have two negative premises. And when you have two negative premises, it's impossible, of course, to have two negative conclusions. The number of negative premises does not equal the number of negative conclusions. And so we have the fallacy of unequal negation. And then we look at the middle term, and the middle term here is selfish people. Selfish people is distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of a negative, and it's also distributed in the second premise because, again, it's predicate of a negative, and a middle term that's distributed twice means the syllogism commits the fallacy of the mal-distributed middle term. And then we can look at the end terms, and the end term Francis is distributed both in the conclusion and in the second premise. Both times it's the subject of a universal, and that's fine. But the end term saints is not distributed in the conclusion because it's predicate of an affirmative, but it is distributed in the first premise because it's subject of a universal. And so we have unequal distribution of the n-term saints. So again, 3 fallacies in number 3. Moving on to number 4, all con artists are amiable. All car salesmen are amiable, and therefore all car salesmen are con artists. So we note here we have 3 universal affirmative statements, and we also know then that we have 3 subject terms that are distributed and 3 predicate terms that are not distributed, subjects of universals and predicates of negatives being distributed. So we can then apply the rules of inference with 3 affirmatives. We know that unequal negation does not apply here. The middle term is amiable people, and amiable is not distributed at all because both times it's predicate of an affirmative, so we have maldistributed middle. And then we can look at the n-term car salesman, which is distributed twice, both times as the subject of a universal. And for an n-term, that's fine. You want it equal above and below the line. But then we have con artists, which is not distributed in the conclusion, but it is distributed in the first premise. And so that's unequal distribution of the n-term con artists. Number 5, all Republicans are conservative. Some members of the Student Senate are not Republicans, therefore some members of the Student Senate are not conservative. So in this case, we have a universal affirmative premise in the first premise. We have a particular negative in the second premise and a particular negative in the conclusion. With the universal affirmative, the subject term, Republicans, is distributed, but conservatives is not. It's the predicate of an affirmative. In the second premise, the subject term is not distributed because it's subject of a particular, but the predicate term is distributed because it's predicate of a negative. So Republicans is distributed in that second premise. And then in the conclusion, we have another particular negative, and in this case, again, the subject term of the particular members of the Student Senate is not distributed, but the term conservative, predicate of a negative, is distributed. And so when we look at the rule for equal negation, we have 1 negative conclusion and 1 negative premise, and so this syllogism passes by that rule. We then look at the middle term, which is Republicans. It's the term that appears in both premises, but not in the conclusion. And Republicans, we note, is distributed twice. It's distributed here in the first premise as the subject of a universal, and it's distributed here in the second premise as the predicate of a negative. And that tells us that this syllogism commits the fallacy of maldistributed middle. And then we can look at the n terms. Members of the Student Senate is not distributed in the conclusion. It's also not distributed in the second premise. Both times it's the subject of a particular, and that's okay. And then we have conservative, and conservative is distributed in the conclusion as predicate of a negative, but not distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of an affirmative. And so in this instance, with the n term conservative, we have unequal distribution of the n term conservative. Number 6, some stamp collectors are unmarried. No unmarried people are good drivers, and some good drivers are not stamp collectors. So again, we start with a particular affirmative. We have a second premise that's a universal negative, and we have a conclusion that is a particular negative. we look at the distribution scheme, and in the first premise we have a subject term and a predicate term that are not distributed. In the second premise, we have a subject term and a predicate term, both of which are distributed. And then in the conclusion, we have a subject term that's not distributed. It's subject of a particular, but a predicate term that is distributed because it's predicate of a negative. Now we look at the rule of equal negation. We have one negative conclusion and one negative premise. And so that's okay. We want the number of negative premises to equal the number of negative conclusions. We have the middle term, unmarried people, and unmarried people is distributed in the second premise. It's the subject of a universal, but it is not distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of an affirmative. And that too is okay. Middle terms must be distributed once and only once, and this one is as the subject term of a universal negative in the second premise. Then we go to the conclusion and we look at the end terms. Good drivers is not distributed in the conclusion. It's the subject of a particular, but it is distributed in the second premise because it is predicate of a negative. So we know we have unequal distribution of the end term good drivers. And then we can look at the other end term, stamp collectors. And we note that stamp collectors is distributed in the conclusion because it's predicate of a negative, but it is not distributed in the first premise because it is subject of a particular. And so in this case, we also have unequal distribution. We'll just make that a ditto of the end term stamp collectors. And so in this syllogism, it is invalid because it commits the fallacy of unequal distribution, and it commits that fallacy twice for both end terms. Number 7, some workers are homeless. All homeless people are poor, and therefore some poor people are workers. So we start with a particular affirmative. We have a universal affirmative as the second premise and a particular affirmative as the conclusion. In the first premise, neither term is distributed because it's a particular affirmative. In the second premise, the subject term is distributed, subject of a universal, but the predicate term is not because it's predicate of an affirmative. And in the conclusion, neither term is distributed because it's particular affirmative. So we have all affirmative statements, so we don't have unequal negation. Our middle term is homeless people, and homeless people is distributed in the second premise, but not distributed in the first premise, and that's okay. Middle terms must be distributed once and only once. And then with the end terms, the end term poor people is not distributed in the conclusion, and neither is it distributed in the second premise where it's predicate of an affirmative. So that's equal distribution, and that's okay. And then we look at the end term workers, and workers is not distributed in the conclusion. It's predicate of an affirmative, and neither is it distributed in the first premise where it's subject of a particular, and that's okay. So this syllogism passes all the tests. It is indeed a valid syllogism. Number 8, some women are celibate. Some students are not women, and therefore some students are not celibate. So in this instance, we have a particular affirmative followed by a particular negative and a conclusion that is also a particular negative. In the first premise, neither term is distributed. In the second premise, the predicate term, women, is distributed. It's predicate of a negative. And in the conclusion, the predicate term, celibate, is distributed because it's predicate of a negative. So we look at the number of negative premises, which is 1, the number of negative conclusions, which is 1. So that's fine. We look at the middle term, which is women, and women is distributed once. It's predicate of a negative in the second premise. It's not distributed in the first premise where it's subject of a particular. So the middle term is distributed once, and that's fine. We look at the end term students. It's not distributed in the conclusion. Neither is it distributed in the second premise. So that's equal distribution of students, and that's fine. But then we look at the end term celibate, and celibate is distributed in the conclusion. It's predicate of a negative, but it is not distributed in the first premise where it's predicate of an affirmative, and that's unequal distribution of the end term celibate. Number 9, no orations by Webster are obscure. All orations by Webster are orations with merit, and therefore no orations with merit are obscure orations. So in this case, we start with a universal negative. The second premise is a universal affirmative, and the conclusion is universal negative. In the first premise, both terms are distributed. In the second premise, the subject term is distributed. And in the conclusion, both terms are distributed. If we apply our rules of inference, we have one negative conclusion and one negative premise, so that's fine. We have the middle term orations by Webster, but orations by Webster is distributed twice, both times as the subject of a universal. And so we have maldistributed middle. And then we have the end terms, orations with merit and obscure orations. Orations with merit is distributed in the conclusion, but not distributed in the second premise. And that's unequal, so we have unequal distribution of the end term, orations with merit. And then the other end term, obscure orations, is distributed in the conclusion. It's predicate of a negative, and it's also distributed in the first premise as predicate of a negative, and that's fine. But the syllogism is invalid because it commits the fallacy of the maldistributed middle term, and it commits the fallacy of the unequal distribution of the end term, orations with merit. Then finally, number 10, some ethnic food is delightful. Some ethnic food is spicy, and therefore some spicy food is delightful. So in this case, you'll notice we have 3 particular affirmative statements. And when you have particular affirmatives, you also know you have no distributed terms. So none of the terms in this syllogism are distributed. And that should be a clue right away that it's going to be an invalid syllogism. And in any case, we'll apply the test. We have 3 affirmative statements, so we don't have unequal negation. We have the middle term, ethnic food, but ethnic food is not distributed at all. Both times it's the subject of a particular, and middle terms must be distributed once and only once. So we have maldistributed middle. And then the end term, spicy food, is not distributed at all, and neither is the end term delightful, and that's not distributed at all. So both end terms are equally distributed, but the syllogism is still invalid because it commits the fallacy of maldistributed middle. So that's a quick review of exercise 16, your first test in applying the rules of inference to syllogisms. If you have a question about exercise 16 or any of the items on the exercise, please post them to the discussion board.